I would hate to live in a world where people are considered guilty of a crime simply because they're accused of one. At the same time, I'd hate to see a criminal go unpunished because no one believes the stories of their victims. Part of what makes cases involving rape or sexual abuse so difficult to look into is because if it's not investigated immediately, it's almost impossible to prove that it did happen. Sometimes people get away with these acts because the victims waited too long to say something. Maybe it was because they were too embarrassed, or they didn't come forward because they were afraid of social backlash. We know this, and we want to believe people when they make these claims, especially about something as serious and life-altering as rape. But at the same time, not every claim is true. Some people make these accusations because they know just by saying it, someone's reputation will be ruined. Sometimes they want money or even just attention. But there is another reason, and that's one that people usually don't think about. And what's sad is it probably happens fairly often. What if neither of the two above scenarios are true? What if two people just have sex that one thought was perfectly consensual, but the other one maybe felt uncomfortable with or pressured into, but at the same time they didn't express that to their partner? This leaves one person believing that the experience was consensual and one believing that it wasn't, and neither of them are wrong. People want to believe that one side is a blameless victim and one side is a villain and a liar, but that is rarely the case, because people aren't so simple. For the rest of this video, I want you to be thinking about these things. Try to put aside preconceived notions and your hatred of any of the people involved. Try not to let yourself be motivated by any outside agendas or social pressure. Just look at the facts as they are presented. You can take my opinions into consideration, but remember to think about these things for yourself as well. Do extra research if you want, read the sources for yourself, and as always, keep an open mind. Zaush is a furry surrounded by controversy. Because he's one of the most popular artists in the fandom, he's always in the public eye and under constant scrutiny. Recently, he's been on the mind of the community for allegations concerning child pornography. I've already made a video about this, which I'll link in the description. Because of the current controversy surrounding Zaush, old, unrelated allegations have started to resurface. If you pay any attention to chatter among furry circles, you've probably seen people state that years ago Zaush was accused of rape and other sexual misconduct towards several women. This wasn't the first time I had heard of this. These allegations are primarily from 2010, so they get mentioned every once in a while. While these allegations are serious, I always just kind of brush them off as typical furry rumor milling. But because of the rumor's persistence, this is the first time I've ever felt compelled to actually look into the allegations. While I expected to find a few offhand remarks or jokes, the typical culprit for this kind of thing, what I actually found was far more compelling. In 2010, the popular furry site Fur Affinity came under attack and dozens of private messages between its members were leaked to the public. Many of these notes belonged to the site's administrator, Dragoneer. Among them was a conversation between Dragoneer and one of the other site's users, Ferality. I'm going to read the note in its entirety because it's important that you hear exactly what she has to say. I'd like your advice on an issue I have with a very well-known user of this site. I don't know who else I could turn to. Less than a year ago, this user coerced me into having sex with him. He manipulated me emotionally when I was depressed and especially vulnerable. I am dealing with the trauma that situation has caused. Only after my experience with him did I hear about him having done the same thing to other female artists within the furry fandom. I do wish someone had warned me about him. I know that he is beginning the cycle again with at least one female artist that I know, who has just turned 18. He is at least 27 years of age and is very well aware of what he is doing. I can only speculate how many others he has solicited. It especially concerns me that while in his presence, he boasted about his previous use of alcohol to rape a girl. My question to you is, should I stay quiet like the majority of his victims have, or should I say something? And if I say something, should I avoid saying it on Fur Affinity? I have never spoken up about my experience with him except to those closest to me. If I could prevent him from abusing another person like he has me, I think it would be worth it. Thanks for your time, Ferality. Dragoneer responds by saying that he'll look into it, but warns her that going public might be a bad idea. Ferality replies with a testimony of exactly what happened. This is the bulk of the note and the portion we will be focusing on the most. I've omitted some names to protect those who expressed that they don't want people to continue to contact them about this. While the uncensored version is available to the public, I urge you to comply with the wishes of those whose names are omitted. They've been given a chance to be part of this video, and they've either not replied or have specifically stated that they don't want to be involved in the drama anymore. Ferality continues. Thank you, and I agree that something like this would probably turn dirty, which is why I chose to contact you first. Drama or revenge is not what I'm after. What has been done, and I only seek to prevent it from happening to other people. The person is Zaush, and the date of the event is this past New Year's weekend. I had been talking with him via AIM, sadly I do not have any logs, and personal cell phone texts and calls. This is also when he had still been in a relationship with his ex-fiancée. They had both explained to me that they were in a swinging relationship when I met them in person at Califer earlier this year, June 5 to 7, 2009. During the convention, he expressed interest in having sex with me, which I declined and let him know I had a boyfriend. He then proceeds to try and convince me to do an art trade with him depicting our characters having sexual relations, to which I told him I wasn't comfortable with. I told them both that I admired their artwork and intended only to be friends with them. They both seemed okay with this. After the convention, Zaush talks to me on AIM and constantly brings up sexual conversations. I eventually tell him I was physically incapable of having penetrative sex, which at the time was a great source of depression for me, in hopes that he would leave me alone. He goes on to insist that I am emotionally broken and my current relationship is the source of my agony. The relationship I was in ended shortly after this exchange, and I sought to spend some time single in order to figure out some things for myself. I continued to talk to both Zaush and his fiancée during this time, and decided to visit them in early October in order to take a look at her art college, since I was seeking out possible colleges to transfer to. I was nearing the end of my associate's degree. I'd like to point out that we know Ferality was at least 20 years old here. I want to put to rest the rumor that the rape allegation came from a minor. Ferality continues. During my stay there, I was constantly pressured by Zaush into having sex with him and his fiancée, although I explained to him before I arrived and during my stay that I was not interested. I eventually relented and allowed him to massage me while I was topless. He then proceeded to pull down my shorts every chance he got while he was on top of me. At that point, I was too confused and intimidated to tell either of them I was uncomfortable. This event ended in them having sex together in front of me. I left the next day. I stopped talking to Zaush after this for a while, but eventually resumed contact with him nearing the end of the year. He began insisting that I visit again, stating that it wasn't fair that his fiancée slept around while he didn't get to, and that I owed him sex. He called me angrily twice to yell at me about his frustrations that I wasn't comfortable visiting or having sex with him. I became very depressed. He began to explain that he was just trying to act in my best interest and that he could help me with my sexual dysfunction. He claimed to have helped another woman with the same issue. When he explained that his fiancée was going away to spend New Year's Eve with her father, he again pleaded that I would come down to spend the weekend with him. After being badgered and harassed, I gave in and arrived at his house. He called his fiancée shortly after I arrived and asked her permission to have sex with me, which I think was also another way to manipulate me. He asked me if I ever drank before, and I said no, then proceeded to tell me that he wouldn't give me any alcohol before he fucked me, because he had been accused by women of using alcohol to... There's a word missing here, but I'm assuming she meant to say rape her. This made me very uncomfortable. We were the only ones at his house, and I was 3 hours away from home. I insisted that we use condoms, but he would not. Since he was much larger than me, I'm 5'2", I felt like he would become violent if I had chosen to leave at that time. So I stayed and had unprotected penetrative sex with him at his house. I spent 2 nights, December 31st, 2009, January 1st, 2010, and left in the morning of the third day, January 2nd, 2010, because I had work later the same day. He begged me to quit my job and stay with him because he was so lonely. I was glad to have an excuse to leave. I have been tested for all major STDs ever since. Sorry for being so long-winded. This was my personal encounter. The artists I know of which either he has stated he has done this to, or have stated themselves that he has approached them soliciting sex are... Ferality then proceeds to list off a few names of artists, including one she's especially concerned about due to her being 18, before concluding. I'm concerned for the safety of the other female artists because he chooses to prey on smaller females, around 5 feet in height, while he is actively working out and taking protein supplements, is emotionally manipulative, and becomes verbally violent when resisted. Thank you for your time, Ferality. The conversation between Dragoneer and Ferality then goes on for a few more posts. The majority of it involves Ferality asking Dragoneer what to do about the situation, and Dragoneer giving advice. I've included the entire conversation in the Yiffy Leaks link in the description. You can take a look if you'd like. In her testimony, Ferality paints Zaush as a sexually aggressive brute who won't take no for an answer. While she never uses the word rape to describe her encounter, she does suggest that he coerced her into sex. I wouldn't blame anyone for reading this and coming to the conclusion that what she is describing is rape. However, there are 2 sides to every story, with the truth lying somewhere in between. It wouldn't be for another 3 years until Zaush made a formal reply to the accusations. I won't be reading Zaush's testimony in its entirety as it's quite wordy and detailed and includes numerous chat logs between himself and Ferality. I've included a link in the description for you to read it yourself, and I encourage you to do so. What I will be doing instead is comparing the 2 testimonies and taking notes of where they differ. Zaush begins by explaining how he met Ferality at Califer in 2009. How he was in an open relationship with his fiancée, how he approached her about sex, and how she turned him down because her boyfriend wouldn't like it. He even mentions the part where she turns down a not-safe-for-work art exchange. Finally, the 2 exchange contact information. So far, the stories match perfectly. The first deviation begins when the two start talking on AIM. If you're unaware, AIM is an old chat messenger program, similar to Skype. Zaush says, when she did get back in touch with me, she was in the middle of a breakup with her boyfriend, and the topic of fooling around became center stage. Her opinion toward casual sex reversed almost overnight, and a planned visit to our home, for the additional purpose of touring the local art college my fiancé was currently attending, was arranged between the two of them. The events described in Ferality's testimony are the same, but the tone is much different. While both agree that conversations of a sexual nature took place, Ferality insinuates that these were unwanted. The opposite is true from Zaush's perspective. This is going to come up a lot throughout the remainder of this video. The events that took place are the same in both accounts, but the described attitudes of the two involved are very different. What makes Zaush's testimony stand out is the inclusion of chat logs from the mentioned AIM conversations with Ferality. The chat logs here take place just before the visit. Zaush and Ferality discuss her coming to their house when the conversations turn quite lewd. They discuss, in detail, sexual positions and body types they like. Not only does Ferality engage with Zaush here, but she does so enthusiastically. Nothing about this conversation seems unwanted or unwarranted from Ferality's perspective. This is also going to be a common trend. While Ferality continuously implies in her testimony that all sexual advances were unwanted, the chat logs show otherwise. Moving on, Zaush describes Ferality coming to visit in early October. Both describe the same kind of nude or partial nude massage, and the night ending with Zaush and his fiancée having sex in front of Ferality. Once again, the events described here are the same, but Ferality's attitude changes drastically depending on the testimony. Ferality says that she was constantly pressured for sex by both Zaush and his fiancé, but made it clear that she didn't want to do anything, implying that she accepted the topless massage as a sort of compromise. Zaush describes it as a nude massage, makes no mention that Ferality seems uncomfortable, and implies that Ferality did want to have sex, but they didn't only because she was on her period. The next line of Zaush and Ferality's testimony are one of the few times where someone is outright lying. Zaush says that the AIM chats continued immediately after Ferality's visit, while Ferality states she didn't speak to Zaush again until the end of the year. We can go to the chat logs marked by Zaush as happening on October 6th, a few days after the visit. This log is quite long, and the two discuss a number of topics, but at no point does Ferality seem at all uncomfortable with the previous meeting. In fact, she speaks favorably of the entire experience, and her and Zaush schedule another meetup. The conversation once again becomes quite lewd, and the two discuss sexual activities they'll take part in. Once again, Ferality is just as enthusiastic in these discussions as Zaush is. At no point does she seem uncomfortable with any of it, completely contrary to how she says she felt in her testimony. Zaush goes on to say that the planned visit in October never happened, but the two continue to discuss yet another visit. Ferality also talks about these discussions, but in her testimony, she implies that Zaush tried to manipulate her into visiting him by saying things like she owed him sex and that he yelled at her in phone calls over not having sex with him. She says that he harassed her into coming down until she finally gave in, but once again, the chat logs are on Zaush's side. In them, Ferality seems very interested in the idea of sex and at no point seems uncomfortable, nor does Zaush seem forceful or demanding. Later, at the end of December, Ferality once again visits Zaush. In her testimony, she implies that during that visit, Zaush intimidated her into having sex with him. She then goes on to say that she stayed at his house for 2 more days before leaving. Zaush's testimony corroborates that she came over for 3 days, with the implication that the two had sex during that time, though in Zaush's version, Ferality seemed to enjoy her time there. Zaush also adds the detail that during the visit, Ferality's ex-boyfriend called and caused her grief, and we'll talk about him later. This is where Ferality's testimony ends, but Zaush's goes on for some time. He includes several more chat logs from after the second visit. In them, Ferality doesn't speak ill of the visit or of Zaush, but seems hesitant to continue pursuing a casual sex relationship. The two discuss this at length and seem to be on good terms at the end of it. Zaush then finishes by saying the two met up briefly at another furry convention sometime later, and they were still on friendly terms. His final contact with her was an undisclosed amount of time later, when Ferality sent him several texts explaining she didn't want to have anything to do with him any longer. The testimonies end there, and what we're left with is 2 very different stories. Though the events match up almost perfectly, the attitudes of the individuals involved are completely different. Because of the chat logs that Zaush provides, I'm inclined to say that his side of the story is more credible. If what he is saying is true, then nothing even resembling rape seems to have occurred. But as with anything written online, there is the possibility that these logs are fake. But in this case, I don't really think that that's a reasonable doubt to have. The logs are quite lengthy and elaborate, complete with times, dates, consistent typing patterns, grammatical mistakes, and even a few things that actually do cast a bit of negative light on Zaush here and there. We also have to consider that several of the conversations in the chat logs are referenced in Ferality's testimony. Several of the things Ferality says Zaush said he did say, but it's in a much less aggressive way than she implies. I've read every word of the chat logs, and I just don't feel like it's much of a possibility that they're fake. I encourage you to read them for yourself because it gives a much better idea of what's going on here between Zaush and Ferality, and they're included in Zaush's testimony in the link below. But even if we don't take the chat logs into consideration at all, Ferality's testimony raises a lot of questions. Starting once again at the beginning, Ferality states that Zaush approached her about sex, to which she declined. However, the two still exchanged contact information and began talking over AIM. Ferality says that Zaush constantly brought up sexual conversations, implying that it was causing her a lot of stress. But if that were the case, why didn't she cut off communications with him at that point? She knew from both online and real-life contact that he was very sexual. If it bothered her as much as she claims, why did she continue talking to him? Ferality's continued contact with Zaush raises more questions the longer it goes on. Even though, in her own words, Zaush continually bothered her about sex online and she didn't want to have anything to do with it, she makes plans and eventually visits him. If it bothered her that much, why would she put herself in this situation? She claims that Zaush and his fiancé constantly bothered her about sex while she was there, so why didn't she leave? She mentions only living 3 hours away, so it's highly likely that she drove there herself. At no point does she say they forced her to be there. How could they? In her own words, they were occupied having sex while she was willingly watching. But for me, the clincher is the second visit. If we're going to assume everything Ferality is saying is true up to this point, then by now she should know what kind of person Zaush is. She knows he's going to intimidate her into sex, and she knows how uncomfortable all of this makes her feel. And yet she continues talking to Zaush over AIM, and she still comes down for a second visit. Why would anyone do this? How could anyone willingly put themselves into this situation for a second time? Then, after this sex she knew was going to happen if she showed up, she stayed at his house for 2 more days. None of this sounds like the actions of a person who doesn't want to be there. But what puts me off the most about Ferality's testimony is the use of manipulative language. Her story is filled with remarks and details that serve no purpose other than to make the reader feel sorry for her, or to try to make Zaush's actions seem more villainous. Several times she mentions she was intimidated or that she was afraid he would become violent, but she never describes him doing anything violent or that he was a violent person. To lend to this, she mentions his size, then she says he was so much bigger than her. She adds odd details like that he worked out and took protein supplements. But Zaush is only 5'11" and describes himself as a little bit chubby during that time. While he is taller than her, by no means is he this massive, muscular figure that she tries to make him out to be. She mentions she has been testing for all major STDs ever since the sexual encounter. This information serves no purpose other than to make the reader feel like she's more of a victim. She describes his actions as sexual soliciting, which is a crime involving exchanging money for sex, and I don't think that's what she meant by it, but sexual soliciting sounds a lot sleazier than asking people for sex. She also uses the term verbally violent, which once again is just a more emotionally charged way of saying yell. Ferality's story is also inconsistent at least one point. At the very beginning of her note to Dragoneer, she says that Zaush boasted about his previous use of alcohol to rape a girl. Yet later the quote changes to, "He wouldn't give me alcohol before he fucked me because he had been accused by a woman of using alcohol to rape her." Since we're on the topic, I also want to mention I find it very hard to believe that anyone would boast about using alcohol to rape a girl in front of another woman he was trying to have sex with. I also think it's worth mentioning that in Ferality's own words here, Zaush wouldn't give her alcohol because he didn't want anything he did to be construed as rape. There's also the fact that Ferality is unable to provide any chat records from either AIM or texts, which is especially odd since much of the validity of her testimony relies on those records. This isn't long after she broke off communication with Zaush, so it seems likely she would still have them. If she felt like she had been raped, why wouldn't she hold on to those records to prove what happened to her? There really isn't much more I can say about Ferality or her testimony. Though I'd like to reach her, she seems to have ceased online activity shortly after Zaush posted his rebuttal in 2014. I can't help but think immediately retreating in light of the chat logs being shared only further hurts her credibility, but it's also possible that she was just sick of dealing with the entire situation. So with or without the chat logs that Zaush provided, Ferality's testimony doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. But like I said, there are two sides to every story. Just because Ferality's testimony doesn't stand up very well doesn't mean that Zaush is entirely blameless. Once again, I don't think that the chat logs were faked, but for the sake of fairness, how does Zaush's testimony stand up without them? Well, whether he intended to or not, Zaush describes himself as being a bit pushy about sex. He said that when he met Ferality, he immediately approached her about sex, and when she said that her boyfriend wouldn't like it, he offered an exchange of sexual art. And after she says no again, he still asks for her number. This isn't really the socially acceptable way of how these conversations go, though since we weren't there, we don't know exactly how all of this played out. After all, in the end, Ferality did give him her contact information. Later, after all the visits, Zaush describes conversations he had with Ferality about her ex-boyfriend, who she was trying to get back together with. I can't help but feel that the advice he gives her here is oriented toward not losing her as a sexual partner, rather than doing what's in her best interest. It would also be fair to point out that Zaush also does some of the same sort of manipulative writing that Ferality does, making himself out to be more like a victim with irrelevant details, like his ex dumping him for another guy with a larger income. The way he talks about Ferality's testimony comes off as kind of mocking and dismissive, and he ends his story with a PSA about rape that just comes off as a bit unnecessary. Once again, it seems like an attempt to make himself look like more of a good guy. But the thing is, that's really all I can say about it. I want to be fair here and talk about it as much as I talked about Ferality's, but Zaush's testimony just stands up a lot better. It's consistent, it's thought out, it's detailed, and it makes much more sense of Ferality's actions. While he does come off as very sexually forward, the fact that he includes those things in his testimony lends to its credibility. He acknowledges that his behavior was immature and he shows a willingness to change. I can't say if he has or not, I'll leave that up to you in your personal interaction with him to decide. And as far as the testimonies go, that's really all I can say. That's not quite the end of the story, though. What about the list of people who Ferality said may have been the victims of Zaush's sexual misconduct? The common conception about Zaush is that he's sexually assaulted a number of people, and that rumor likely comes from this list. Ferality states that all of the people on this list were targeted or came out with accusations themselves, but I can't find much to support that. I've tried contacting the people on this list as well as a few others who I found to have some sort of negative experience with Zaush, but unfortunately almost every one of them either wouldn't respond or didn't want to have anything to do with this video. But I did find one series of tweets, and fortunately I was able to get a hold of its owner. Once again, by her request, I'm going to censor the name, but we'll call her Jane. Jane's tweets are a response to Zaush after his initial reaction to finding out about the Ferality note leaks. In the tweets, Jane claims that Zaush at one point harassed her and that Ferality's story sounded familiar. Your boyfriend obviously doesn't love you if he won't let me fuck you. I asked her if other than those words, Zaush had ever sexually harassed her. Her response was, "No, I have not ever met Zaush. There was a period when he overstepped his bounds 10 years ago online. I didn't like it, so I blocked him and moved on with my life. My name appeared in the leaked DMs as someone, still don't know who it was, they never came forward, leaked my locked Twitter account where I bitched him out for his attitude toward the allegations of the person in question. The leaks from my Twitter account were me venting over the time he overstepped his boundaries, again online on AIM. Never met the guy." Later in the conversation, she clarifies what he actually said to her. To be factually correct, Zaush back then said to me that if my partner was too controlling to let me play around, then he was probably abusive. Never directly if he doesn't let you fuck me. She finishes by saying, "I don't hate Zaush. Even now I don't. I said to him personally that I wish he'd do better as he has the talent to do so. Yes, he was overbearing back then, but I feel I did get a sincere apology from him when I finally got up the balls to actually say how I felt." I want to thank Jane for this, as she was one of the few people who was willing to actually engage with me and give me any kind of insight into Zaush's attitude and behavior during this time period. These kinds of testimonies are extremely important for finding out what actually happened. There are numerous other stories from people outside Ferality's list, and upon looking into them, I found a very similar story to Jane's. That is, the claims they make are simply that Zaush asked them for sex at some point. If we compare Zaush's own testimony and the claims made by others, we can find a very clear pattern of behavior. He finds people he's sexually attracted to and approaches them about sex. But other than Ferality, none of the claims are that he was forceful or intimidating while doing so. Typically, when talking about Zaush, the accusations are twofold. He raped someone, and he sexually assaulted a lot of women. But regarding the latter accusations, based on the actual claims made, he was never accused of sexual assault. I'm hesitant to even call it sexual harassment. What I would say happened is he was inappropriate with a few women, something he admits to doing in his own testimony. Zaush, at least at this point in his life, was very interested in a polyamorous relationship and swinging, as he puts it. He approached a lot of people about sex, and I can see how that might be off-putting to a lot of people. And while you don't have to like polyamory or promiscuity, I think we should take into consideration we are talking about the furry fandom. This sort of thing is much more common here than in outside society. I know that I get approached for sex on nearly a daily basis by people I don't know. I just don't see this sort of thing as that unusual. So what remains is the former accusation. Did Zaush rape Ferality? By now you've no doubt made up your mind about the accusations, but at the inevitability of backlash, I want to tell you my honest thoughts and opinions. Do I think that Zaush knew that Ferality was going through a rough breakup and used it to help convince her to have sex with him? Yes, these things are in line with how he acted and treated others during that time. But do I think that he raped her? No, because I don't think that she was coerced or forced to have sex. I think that for a short time she genuinely enjoyed her time with Zaush. Even though the words in her testimony say otherwise, her actions and the chat logs show she wanted to be involved with him and his fiancée in a sexual relationship during that time. I think that after the year or so she was involved with Zaush, she came to regret her actions. Upon further introspection, she probably realized she hadn't been in a very good emotional or mental state during that year, and because of that, she felt that Zaush had preyed upon her vulnerability. However, I don't think it's fair to blame Zaush for this. He couldn't have known that she would later come to regret her actions, because at the time, she was enjoying herself. In fact, he probably thought he was helping her, because being with him legitimately elevated her mood. If you read the chat logs, it's very clear that he cared about her. He asked multiple times what she's comfortable with and what she liked. He was willing to pay for expenses during her visits and spend time with her hanging out and doing things other than just sex. I do think Ferality greatly exaggerated in her note to Dragoneer and outright lied at a few points. As I said before, it's written in a very emotionally manipulative way. I also think it's possible Ferality may have simply misremembered a few events which would explain her inconsistencies. I also think that Ferality's ex-boyfriend has a huge impact on the story, but unfortunately we don't see much of him, so it's not really talked about. From the snippets we do have, we can see that he was a major influence on Ferality. In her testimony, she says she wasn't interested in Zaush because her boyfriend wouldn't like it, not because she wouldn't like it. And we know she was interested in Zaush because as soon as she broke up with her boyfriend, she got involved with him. And then, as quickly as it started, it came to an end as soon as she got back together with that same boyfriend. There is a big part of this story concerning Ferality's emotional state and decision-making that we just aren't seeing. And this is why spreading all these rumors around is such a bad idea, because there are parts of the story that we don't know, and there are parts that we don't know that we don't know. One thing we really have to remember here is that Ferality's note was never meant to be released to the public. From the amount of grammatical errors alone, we can assume it was hastily written. Perhaps it was written at a time when Ferality wasn't in a good state of mind, or maybe she felt pressured by someone else into sending it. Unfortunately, I have no way of getting a hold of her to confirm any of this, and I take her cease of online activity as a sign that she wants to be done with it. We also have to remember that Zaush had 3 years to write up his reply to Ferality, so it's no wonder that his testimony is so much more complete and stands up far better. What I'm saying is that I don't think it's fair to chastise Ferality so much for this either. You don't have to like Zaush. You don't have to forgive him for being awkwardly sexually forward at this point in his life. You don't have to forgive him for the current controversy surrounding him. But I do think it's time that we put to rest this rumor that Zaush raped and sexually assaulted a bunch of women, because there's really no evidence that anything like that actually happened. Of course, that won't stop some people. Gossip is juicy, and people don't like to let things like this go. Once you're accused of something, people will follow you with it for the rest of your life, no matter what kind of evidence they are shown. They take everything that's said as fact, never looking into it themselves and just spreading it around. In fact, some people have taken it upon themselves to make sure that everyone knows whatever rumor is currently circulating, even if they have no idea if it's true or not. I'm talking about one specific individual in this case, one person who alone is half the reason why I began looking into Zaush in the first place. One person who so adamantly claims that Zaush raped someone that they have taken it on as a personal crusade to let everyone know. Over the last few weeks, they've reminded dozens of people of this fact, And what sickens me is that it's completely clear that they failed to do even the most basic of research. When asked for any kind of proof, they respond with things like, I can't seem to find the screenshot of it now, or someone probably has all this cataloged somewhere. You are awful. People like you epitomize what is wrong with the furry community. Do you not realize the seriousness of the accusations you are spreading? Do you not understand that these rumors ruin people's lives? You throw them around like they're nothing. I have to assume that you were just too young and stupid to actually understand what you're doing, because that's the only way I can hang on to any semblance of hope for this community or humanity in general. I want to leave you with a word of caution. You've probably noticed that I've said the word leaked about a dozen times during this video. The original FA notes were leaked, the chat logs were leaked, the censored tweets were leaked, Zaush's Telegram conversations from the last video were leaked. If you don't want everyone online to know about something, don't write it down. It will get out. Even if you only send it to your best friend or your lover or your spouse, it doesn't matter. So, please tell me what you think in the comments. And if you have any information contrary to what I've said in this video, or information about similar controversies in the past, please send it to me and I'll look into it. Don't be the guy who spreads around baseless rumors. And if someone says something on Twitter or wherever, don't just take their word for it. Always ask for proof. Anyway, I'm Kothrix, and you have a wonderful day. Hey everyone, this is just a reminder that I do gameplay streams on Twitch every weekday at 9 PM to 1 AM Eastern. If you want to get a hold of me, the best way is through Twitter. DMs are always open. Finally, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon and Twitch. You make all of this possible.